Welcome to part 2 of the weight painting fundamentals. My name is Demeter, and in this video I'll be going over how to assign automatic weights, how to test your character's deformation, and the brushes and brush settings that I use when I'm weight painting. Here I have a character we used in the coffee run production, and I have a bear skeleton aligned to her proportions. So I'll start by selecting all my objects and parenting them to the armature with the Set Parent to Armature Deform option. Now, you may have a full control rig with fancy controls all over the place. In this case, it is very important that the deform checkbox of those control bones are disabled. By default, this checkbox is enabled on all bones that you create, but only bones that are actually meant to be deforming should have it enabled. It will also save you time if you put all of those deforming bones onto the same layer, so you can select them all easily. In my case though, all I have is a bear skeleton, so all my bones are deforming bones. If I hide the clothing and disable this mask modifier on the body, you can see I have a full base mesh of the character. This is not necessary, but it can make life a bit easier, so I will start by working on just this mesh. We will start by assigning automatic weights. To do this, enter weight paint mode and select all the bones you want the automatic weight distribution algorithm to take into account. Bones that aren't selected will be treated as if they didn't exist, even if they are deforming bones. Then, go to Weights, Assign Automatic from Bones. Blender will have hopefully assigned weights to the vertices based on their proximity to nearby bones. You may encounter a common error that looks like this. Bone heat weighting. Fail to find solution for one or more bones. The error seems to happen when there are too many vertices in a small area, but in world space. And fixing that is super easy. Just temporarily scale your armature up, then run the automatic weights operator. Then just reset your armature scale and you're good to go. Also note that with certain types of geometry, automatic weights can have pretty bad results. Like if you have many disconnected pieces, hair cards, or hard surface objects. For these cases, it might be easier to just weight paint them from scratch. Now we can select bones to see their weights and move or rotate them to see how they deform. This is why I opted to use a bear skeleton for this tutorial. In a proper rig, your deformed bones would most likely be constrained, so you couldn't see the weights and move them at the same time. But here, we will have that luxury. Also note how the colors representing our weights are a bit difficult to see. That's because the character has dark skin and dark clothes, and for some reason in current Blender, the weight paint overlay is multiplied by the character's colors. This is not ideal at all, as it could fool you into thinking your weights are not what they are. To avoid it, set your shading to something that is mostly white. A common practice at this stage, although not required, is to create an animation that rotates each of these bones on the axis they will be rotating on when they are animated. This is very useful for troubleshooting, and I highly recommend it. Just grab a timeline and start rotating bones with R and keyframing them with I. You can work a bit faster with the auto keying option, but be careful not to unintentionally move bones and insert keyframes when using that. Now we're almost ready to start weight painting. But first, let's set the Show Zero Weights overlay option to active and enable Auto Normalize. What this does is after each brush stroke you make, it makes sure that the total weights of deforming bones on a single vertex is exactly 1. This means if you add some weights to one bone, it will subtract the same amount of weights from other bones, proportional to what their weights were beforehand. You can see this in action on this clavicle bone, first without Auto Normalize. Notice how I can paint this clavicle area red for the clavicle bone, but the shoulder bone retains its weights, and so it still takes this mesh with it. Now let's undo that and make the same strokes with Auto Normalize enabled. This time, the weights get subtracted from the shoulder. So on the plus side, this makes it so that the colors that you see while painting accurately represent exactly how much a given vertex will follow a bone. However, it also means that your brush strokes don't affect only the singular vertex group, which is the currently active one. Instead, it can affect any other vertex group. To me, this trade-off is worth it, but I can understand why this option is disabled by default. If you don't understand what it does, you could end up destroying your other vertex groups without realizing. But if you do understand what it does, I think it makes for a more intuitive workflow. Also, remember the Normalize All operator from the previous video. If you want to make sure your vertex groups are normalized to begin with, you can always feel free to run that. Just remember to untick the Lock Active option. Also, in my case, I have a vertex group that is used by the mask modifier. Since this is not a deforming vertex group, I don't want it to be accounted for normalization. For this, I also have to make sure that the operator's subset parameter is set to deform bones only. Next, let's take a look at the tools and brushes we have available. You can press T to open the toolbar, then N to open the sidebar. In the sidebar, you can find settings relating to the active tool under the tool panel. If you're confused as to the difference between tools and brushes, all you need to know is that some tools can have brushes inside them. Click on the big ugly brush icon to bring up a brush selector. Notice that all switching between them does is change the blend mode setting. Now, there are plenty of brush options that we can't see, so I could be lying to you right now, but I'm not. The only difference between this particular set of brushes is their blending mode, and personally, I only use 2 of them, Add and Subtract. What they do is self-explanatory, but let me give an honorable mention to the Draw brush, because I know other people who use it. This brush will blend whatever weight you have under your cursor towards whatever you set as the weight value, so it will add or subtract depending on what weight is already there. You might be thinking, well, what on earth use would there be for other blending modes in weight paint mode besides mix, add, and subtract? After all, those other blending modes are for manipulating colors, and weight painting is not about manipulating colors. Well, it turns out those brushes are shared between weight paint and vertex paint mode, and they make sense to have in the latter. Still, it is actually possible to remove them from weight paint mode only. You can click on this arrow, go on Enabled Modes, and untick weight paint for all the brushes that you don't intend to use. I will do this for all except Add and Subtract. The next tool is the Blur tool, with only one brush. I find this incredibly useful since smooth transitions between two vertex groups is almost always what you want, and that's exactly what this tool lets you do easily. The Average tool paints the average weight value of the weights under the brush. I don't really find this useful. The Smear tool lets you sort of drag weights around. It sounds useful, but I think it's much better suited for colors than weights. And finally, the Gradient tool lets you make a linear or radial gradient. This can be useful when combined with geometry masking options, which I will show off in just a bit, but I don't really use this for characters as I prefer achieving a gradient with the Blur tool. So my workflow exclusive uses Add, Subtract and Blur with Auto Normalize on. And that means I switch between these three brushes quite often. Doing this with clicking on the UI is quite tedious, so we probably want to set up some shortcuts. Go to Edit, Preferences, and Key Map. Find the Weight Paint global category under 3D View Weight Paint and add a new shortcut. The operator to switch tools is called paint.brush_select. I will set the key to the number 1 and choose Draw for the weight tool parameter. Now I will add another shortcut with the same operator, but this time bind it to the number 3 and set the weight tool to Blur. Great, now we can press 1 to go into the Draw tool and 3 for the Blur tool. But what about switching between brushes within the Draw tool? Well, it turns out, if you keep pressing 1, it cycles between the available brushes in the Draw tool. It's a shame we can only see this indicated by this big ugly icon in this big ugly sidebar, so what I like to do is change my cursor colors. Let's make the Add brush red, and the Subtract brush blue. And bam, we can easily switch between our three brushes and know which one we are currently on, while having the 3D view in full screen, with no sidebar and no toolbar in the way. While we're on the topic of shortcuts, you can press F to change the radius of your brush, and Shift F to change the strength. I'm going to add a couple more shortcuts which I can highly recommend. I will bind Alt-W to toggling the wireframe overlay, because I find it something I like to toggle often. And the second one is for toggling the Active Objects in Front option, which I've bound to Alt-X. This lets me get my bones out of the way. Next, let's brush over the brush settings. Thankfully, there aren't a whole lot of them that are all that important, at least if you ask me. There's Accumulate, which when enabled will cause your brush to have its effect applied over and over again, within the same stroke, if you go over the same area. I don't use this, but I probably should, because it would result in fewer undo steps while I'm painting. Front faces only is quite important to be aware of, as it can be very helpful for avoiding accidentally painting on the back of your mesh. For the beginning of the process though, painting across our mesh is something that we want. And finally, there is the Fall Off Shape setting. This is set to Sphere by default, which means the effect of your brush tapers off in the shape of a 3D sphere around the point where your mouse is touching the surface. The other option is Projected, which makes the effect of your brush taper off in the shape of a 2D circle around your mouse instead, regardless of the shape of the mesh. I don't think you ever need to touch any other brush settings, however, there are still some weight paint mode options. For now, I just want to make sure that we can paint symmetrically. So let's go in the Symmetry panel, enable X-axis symmetry, then paint some weights on the left side of the character. We are painting this in the vertex group def_upperarm.L, so we would expect that this also affected def_upperarm.R, but that's not the case. The symmetry options are unaware of our character's bones. It will simply add the same weights on the opposite side of the mesh into the same vertex group. That is not what we want. Disable X-axis symmetry and enable X-mirror instead and try again. Now it does what you would expect. I made quite a mess here, so let me reassign automatic weights and start over. Now we can actually start weight painting our character. Just walk through the animation and find the spots where it deforms poorly, which is most likely everywhere. So look at a point that's deforming poorly and try to identify why is it deforming poorly in terms of the relationships between the vertices and the bones. Which vertices are being affected too much or too little by which bones? If a bone is pulling an area too much, subtract some of its weights from that area. If a bone is not pulling an area enough, add weights for that bone to that area. Use the blur brush every now and then to make sure you have a smooth gradient. I just got to the hand and fingers. While we're here, I want to show you a slightly different approach to weight painting. This approach is what I would use when weight painting from scratch without automatic weights. Let's call it hierarchical painting. What I do is select a bone that is high in the hierarchy, and in this case this will be the hand. Then I will use the add brush to paint everything belonging to this bone and all of its children to red. So moving the hand bone moves the hand, but moving any of the finger bones does nothing. Now I can go down the hierarchy step by step and repeat the process. For the first bone, I paint the entire finger red. Now just repeat this for the whole hierarchy. As you can see though, I eventually run into an issue where small weights start showing up assigned to random bones. I can subtract these manually to get rid of them, but they will just keep coming back. This is due to an issue with auto-normalize. The best way I know of to avoid it is to run the clean vertex groups operator often. This will delete zero weights, so they can't be involved in normalization at all. I bound this to the shortcut Shift-C, but you might want to choose a different combination. Another tip for painting fingers is to use the masking options. You can enable vertex masking with V, or face masking with M. This way you can only paint on the verts or faces that are selected. You can also hide parts of the mesh so they are out of the way and cannot be painted on. While in a masking mode, you can still select bones by holding Ctrl. That's pretty much all there is to it. What I showed you so far should let you start weight painting in Blender in a mostly pain-free way. In the next and final video, I will be showing off some extra tips for nicer deformations, as well as an add-on I made to make weight painting even less painful. Thanks for watching, and have a good one.